Welcome, everybody. So today's presentation is it's actually a presentation I have given before, but I'm adding some new slides and updating it a bit. This part of the presentation is going to be mostly going over old material, and then I will go into the deeper part of it and how it all ties together. And interestingly, I am on the last day of one of these important pranayama immersions as I do this. So it feels very fitting. However, I do need to make a disclaimer that sometimes I can be a bit spacey when I'm in the middle of these immersions. But it's a very, very auspicious thing to share about these whilst in it, and I hope I do it justice. So, this presentation, the first time I presented on this was, I think, in 2022 at the Breathe Festival in England. And then we gave another version of it along the way at another gathering. And now this is the new modified version for our death course. So we're going to look here at these more micro little deaths that we go through every day. And the concept of pranayama, this is ancient breath work, and how pranayama can also be tied to the concept of taming the ego, and how taming the ego, working with pranayama, and some of the other things we're going to allude to in this discussion are also the little acts that we can do daily to help to prepare for death ourselves, okay? And not only that, that when we become more mindful of how to engage with practices, with these ways of being, with these little deaths, that they also can become very, very important keys to time travel, to the golden age, and to liberation. Okay, and I just really want to give gratitude to all my pranayama and tantric teachers, Khentrul Rinpoche, Jenica Bronson, Yogananda, Babaji, Swami Geetananda, and many more, some of whom will be mentioned in this presentation. Okay, so we're going to look in this presentation at the concept of the breath, prana, and pranayam or pranayama. It can be used interchangeably. I will also just mention a few teachers and lineages of pranayama that I have found very effective. And the first part of this presentation is a repetition of these other presentations we did before. And I'll stop probably around the point where we are talking a little bit about the benefits of pranayama before we go really into the more super multidimensional potential of pranayama. And I hope you'll understand what I mean when I do that. And yeah, I really hope that it helps you to see that pranayama is not just amazing for overcoming illnesses, for helping us to feel better, for helping us to feel more balanced, but then actually the breath is the key. Okay. And of course, every breath we take is its own life, death, rebirth process. So we'll also be broadening the discussion later to the concept of breath, pranayama, natural law, time, and the body, and how these things can all interrelate. Again, we will be talking about one or two lineages here, and then how that connects to this concept of taming the ego, and how taming the ego and the breath can also be connected. And then again, how the interrelation of breath, working with karma, working with natural law, working with time, how these are actually very important acts of fractal alignment, bridging microcosm and macrocosm, and how those can actually springboard us into sacred activism. And then how that ties into concepts of the Golden Age and Shambhala. So, again, I could spend just a presentation on the importance of the breath. And I think we can all be very aware that the first thing that we do when we come into life as we know it is that we take our first breath. And similarly, when we die, the last thing that happens is that we take our last breath. And of course, there may be discussions people want to bring, like, okay, what is the brain still dead? Is alive, dead? What is happening? But really, what we've been understanding from the teachings on this course is this thing about the dissolution of the winds. Okay. And so as the winds dissolve, we take our last breath, as our senses start to diminish, as the energy moves back into its more subtle form from which it came. Okay. So as we start to lose our grip with the material world, as we become back homecoming to the spirit world in many ways, we take our last physical breath. And Swami Muktananda said, there are many sadhanas, but there is also a final sadhana. The best and greatest sadhana is to worship the Lord of Prana. Prana is the highest deity, the vital force of the universe. Everything is under its control. Shivaism, or Shaivism, it's not pronounced that way here, says that the universal consciousness, which is nothing but God, is inside you in the form of prana, which constantly comes in and goes out. When the incoming breath and the outgoing breath become balanced and equal, that is when you have God's darshan. So it's like God's offering, God's blessing. Okay. And so Swami Muktananda here is just also speaking of how that there is a science to the breath, that obviously when we have God's blessing, this is when we have mastered balance of incoming and outgoing breath. And any student of pranayama will also learn that we have different counts for different outcomes. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different pranayamas, and some will regulate our nervous system. Some will agitate our karma to bring us up to burn things. Some will help us to achieve higher states of consciousness. Some will help us feel more protected. Some will help us to become more subtle. You know, there are very, very distinct sciences about even which nostril you're using at any given time, what part of the nostril the air is in, how deeply you're breathing in or out. And then there's a science to this as well, as to how you align that with every single thing you do in a day, and what acts you do dependent on which nostril is activated at the time that you get up, and which foot you then put on the ground when you get out of bed in alignment with the nostrils that you're breathing in through. And how also, if you are seeing that that is not advantageous, once you learn to read the science, and this is of course the very subtle deep teachings of pranayama, you can then change those around. And so there are stories of battles that were seemingly won because the 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 army was able to position its people, its soldiers, at a certain direction. And it had studied also pranayama, the breath, dawn. And there are all these sacred sciences where we can actually, to some degree, manipulate the outcome of results through even how we take our first breath and what we do with the breath, and how we may make it more or less subtle, and depending on what we wish for the outcome to be. Of course, these things can be used for the power of not so good. And this is why some of these teachings are protected, because people could manipulate others through these things. But yeah, I'm not even going to touch the surface really today and what I'm going to talk about, but just really the science is exceedingly intricate. And the more we have mastery of that, the more we actually connect to our divine essence. And I think we're all aware that if you are freaking out and somebody tells you to take deep breaths, or you feel a lot of stagnant energy and you exhale energy quickly, there are ways that you can really regain your stabilization, or to feel more grounded or less anxious, just by one or two mindful breaths. So that's just easy for anybody to understand. So Al Lee and Don Campbell in Perfect Breathing also said, every neuron, every synapse, every muscle feeds on the flame of your breath. Breathing is not only critical to sustaining life, but done correctly and consciously, it can be a valuable tool for getting the most out of every human endeavor. So you can see, sometimes you see these people who are not living. And often, if you examine them, they are maybe hunched over, okay? They're not boosting their lung capacity. They are not utilizing the life-giving force of prana and how it flows around their circuitry, okay? So just to break this down, we're going to look at what is prana. And prana is, okay, source of life-giving properties. It is a vital energy that it's not breath per se. Prana, if you go up a mountain or if you eat a lot of raw chlorophyll or green foods or you stand near a waterfall, you get that rejuvenation energy, okay? And there's prana in the living world, okay? And this is often why a lot of ascetics and yogis go up to the high mountains because there's already more prana. So that's why we can often feel an elevated sense of mood, spiritual connection when we go to sacred places. And a lot of sacred places are in nature, okay? And so prana is in all living things. So it's a life force energy. And what happens is that our body filters prana. So, of course, it stands to reason if you're in a polluted city, you don't have as much prana around you because you don't have waterfalls and things like that. And you've got air that's quite polluted. And what's happening, but however, you can still extract some prana, but you may have to try harder. Okay. And so what happens is that we've got the olfactory bulb, which is in the head, kind of behind the nose, sort of almost near the third eye. Okay, the olfactory bulb is a very, very important mechanism within our body. And this converts the prana from the environment. And this is extracting the life force energy that we can then use wisely to circulate around our body, to feel good, to boost our energy. And of course, an oxygenated body is already, we know a lot about oxygen being very good for the body. And when we have good amounts of oxygen, it will override the harm done by free radicals, which of course makes pathogens grow and can lead to things like cancer and dis-ease. But prana is not oxygen per se. Oxygen is a molecule. And how, but the act of creating more oxygen in our body and pulling the prana in are often similar acts. So we're getting a kind of double whammy of benefit. But prana is really this very sublime, sparkly life force energy that makes us feel alive. It makes us feel inspired. It makes us feel protected and more complete. Okay. And this is why we want to, if we're on a spiritual path, to boost our prana. And of course, if we're living in like a dense city environment, it's very easy to pick up the energy from other people, from EMFs, all sorts of things. So extracting what prana we can from the environment through acts of pranayama are very important personal practice to keep us feeling robust. And that is why you can see people who do, even people who do a lot of things like breath work. So the kind of popular breath work at the moment, which is indeed very, very popular in cities, which is often quite cathartic, more cathartic, but less aligned to a sacred science. These things like conscious connected breath work or rebirthing, things like this. A lot of the essence of what these are about is that that again, the practitioner is and the patient, whoever's taking part in the session, is usually doing quite a lot of breath that is elevating the amount of prana that's coming into their body. Okay. And this again, different breath works will have slightly different outcomes. And again, usually the person feels very expanded after. And people who do a lot of that sort of breath work are also able to manage their health well in city environments. But what is different is that a lot of pranayamas are coming from the sacred sciences as a branch of yoga, and they are actually usually tied up with concepts of numerology, of an understanding of the precise sciences of the breath and the numerology around the breath. And therefore, they can create deeper karmic outcomes. They can create more mindful elevation to spirituality. Whereas a lot of the body sort of breath work sessions that people do are very much up in that branch of self-care, healing. And that's brilliant because we have so many people now at least starting to become more connected to the breath, which is already a bonus. However, they're not necessarily doing it mindfully with adherence to the sacred science of the actual numerology around pranayama, which nails it even more. Okay. So when we're doing pranayama per se, rather than maybe a breath work session, the pranayama is utilizing information that was brought through like by highly realized sages and beings like the rishis to help us to dance with the sacred numerology of the universe and aligning us and our body and our work with prana mindfully. And when we become mindful with sacred numerology, with concepts that are universal principles, you can see how we can start to come into a better relationship with our whole existence because we're not just passively breathing in a contracted way. We're actually applying intelligence plus optimizing the breath in particular ways that actually bring very, very distinct results. Okay. So it's very strategic. And pranayama essentially has sometimes there will be different things that we're doing with different parts of, say, the diaphragm or the sections of the lungs. But we're also generally working with retentions, inhalations, and exhalations. And this will bring specific effects, which are documented and now even subject to some evidence-based studies. Okay. And as I said earlier, pranayama is known generally to oxygenate the body and have these amazing, wide-reaching physical, emotional, and spiritual benefits. So every breath that we are taking is just something that is not just a science when we apply ourselves, but is also a microcosmic little baby death. Okay. And so some pranayama teachers will tell you these meanings and others will not. And so Yama is one of the gods of death. And prana, as we know, is life-giving force. But sometimes people will talk about pran and then ayama, which is a slightly different meaning. But today we'll look at it in terms of prana, yama, life and death. So every birth with the breath, we inhale, we bring in life force energy, we purify through the olfactory bulb, we bring in this life force energy. And then often, if we're doing a mindful pranayama, we may have a breath retention, we may hold, and we may not in some breath work, okay? And that is like a liminal space in itself. The space is in between. Okay. And this is often when we're on a spiritual journey, just like we talk about the bardo, we have bardos between this life and then we have the, when we're dead, we're in a bardo. So we're in between one life and another, but we're still in a very important liminal space where a lot of karma is being dealt with. Okay. And so this is similar when we're doing a breath retention things are happening. Okay. And actually, as we'll see later, when we start to give signals off to the universe, when we start to hold our breath for longer than normal, we start to give messages that we're not just passively being appointed our karma and that we are not in control of time. It is said that we have a certain amount of breaths in this life. And so if we're always running around really stressed and breathing really fast, in theory, we're using up our breaths. But when we start to intelligently use breath retention, we're starting to give a message saying, I outwit this. I seek for more. I understand that I am not just this karmic 3D person who's subject to time. Okay, and very interesting things happen. And we start to reclaim time. We start to realize we've got more time. We start to not be dominated, okay, by the influences that keep us very much an agent of our own karma, okay? Or not even agent, a passive victim in many ways, okay? So every breath is a birth and death. So as we've maybe retained the breath, we then exhale. And as we release that carbon dioxide, we are also, there's a death, okay? And we're letting go of something, and something is dissolving. And then, of course, we then have another cycle. So this is very much like the cycles of birth and death that we have with the material body. Life, death, rebirth, okay? So it's this cyclical process. And so as a microcosm, the human is this breathing microcosm of the higher essence of what it is to take form. And this almost endless rebirth process we go into. And the spiritual journey for people, especially in cultures which understand the concept of moksha, liberation from samsara, samsara being this looped karmic existence that goes round and round and round. The more we decide, I just want to be a consciousness stream with all that is. I just want to join the void. And if we realize we're coming maybe to the end of our incarnation cycle, pranayama is very important because we can start to master the breath, which is starting to say, I seek mastery over these cycles where I'm just constantly being reborn as a rat, as a dog, as a warrior, as a despot, as a ruler, as whatever, okay? And so the conscious use of the breath through pranayama is also saying, I seek to have more agency over my death process. And as we'll see later, working to cultivate in this life yogas and pranayamas which challenge the conventional use of the breath and the winds and the circuits are an amazing preparation for when we die, because we're already purifying a lot of karma when we're moving through those. But we're also going into a state of starting to understand some of the things that will happen when we start to dissolve, when we take our last breath. And the more mastery and training we can have for that while we're alive, the more it's going to be a walk in the park. And we might not even have so much to deal with in the bardo later. We may even go beyond the bardo. We might not have to spend long in there. And the bardo is seen for many as a very challenging place to be. And unless a person has some understanding of how to navigate the bardo of death, they may not have much agency over how they get reborn, okay, if you believe in rebirth. And I'm not going to go too into that, but basically we have this concept of maybe being able to be reborn in a pure realm, or to at least be reborn in the earth plane and be close to enlightened beings or high guides or a guru that we already had a connection with. And if a person has been flailing around and not making much use of their breath or this life, when they get into the bardo, they're just going to be flailing around. They're going to be overcome by images of their unconscious, stuff they haven't processed in life. And that can be like a really crazy dream, okay?